Welcome back to Powered by Ancestry. I am Chris Gunadu, your guide and host. On this episode, we answer yet another important question about ancestry. And this question comes from one of our subscribers who asked, please speak on how the Abrahamic religions, which were forced upon us, hindered our intellectual and spiritual development. For clarity's sake, by Abrahamic religions, the person is referring to Judaic Christian theologies or dogmas, that is broadly Christianity, which includes Catholicism and Judaism, and certainly Islam. So those are the three or four variants of what is broadly Judeo-Christian theology and dogma. So that's what the person means by Abrahamic religions, right? That said, let's delve into this question. Right? So let's get some historical context. We always need context, which is setting, time, and place, right? To put the question in perspective. So the idea of these religions being forced upon us by us, the references to African peoples and people of African ancestry. Yes, coercion and force is a part of the equation, but it's not the full story. Meaning that the history of Judeo-Christian thought has a geography in Africa that is important to consider. Judeo-Christian thought takes a hold tangentially in Northeast Africa, particularly around these formerly known polities of Numidia, Carthage. Think about Hannibal and the elephants crossing the Alps into what is now Italy. And of course, ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt, that region down to about the Ethiopian highlands, right? So that Northeast African corridor is the locus or the region which received Judeo-Christian dogma. And that stayed or remained that way for some time. Now, because we often use the Christian calendar, which is the Gregorian calendar, we don't really know when what was called by the Romans the Jesus movement began, because this fictive or mythic person, if it ever existed, called Jesus, that person's birth and death is the calendar. So we can't figure out when he lived or died because he's the calendar. And so the calendar has to exist before him, but the calendar comes after him, if he existed. And I hope I didn't confuse you too much. The point I'm making is that we don't know for sure when this Christian theology and dogma entered that Northeast African corridor. But we do know is this, that according to this calendar, sometime around first to 3rd century, there is this movement under the then Roman Empire. And this movement begins obviously spreading, because whether you're a trader or a merchant or a sailor, people bring with them not simply goods and services, but bring with them their ideas and their dogmas. Now, Christianity, like Islam and Judaism, these are proselytizing religions, would mean that they seek to gather converts. They seek out souls to be members of their club. And they have a simple proposition or ultimatum. Either you're with us and you are a member of our community of believers, or you're the enemy and you should be vanquished or convert. That's a very rough but simple but mostly accurate sense of how they operate. So these religions are not only invading, in many cases, not all, because they do come by way of trade as well, which is a different kind of invasion, economic invasion, but they come by way of intruders, right? And they settled in that corridor. And so by the 7th or 8th century or 9th century, only that part of that corridor, there were patches of Christian or Christianized communities. And it remained that way for a long time. Christianity, therefore, only reached West Central Africa through the Portuguese in the late 15th century, 16th century. So really what you have is that Northeast African corridor, some communities surviving in what is now Nubia, what is now Sudan, and some of the Ethiopian highlands among the Orthodox Ethiopian Church, and then, of course, in the Congo. So you really have pockets. You don't really have broad Christianization. The same is true for Islam. Islam settles around West Africa, North Africa, and, of course, on the East African coast. That's sort of the geography, right? Now, all that is important because the notion that these were forced upon African peoples is only partially accurate, because these dogmas came through, again, traders and merchants and proselytizers and religious zealots as well as warmongers. These were all the mechanisms through which Islamization and Christianization occurred. But remember, in patches. And that patch is important because when you think about those of us who came to the American diaspora through transatlantic slaving on a mostly one-way voyage, those African peoples came from, in many cases, non-Islamic and non-Christian communities. Because those communities were usually small and fringe. Yes, in upper West Africa, there were more Islamized communities, but even then, the belief was largely among the elites, right? It was only up until maybe the 17th, 18th century of the Gregorian calendar that West Africa experienced a broader, more mass Islamization through the Fulbe or Fulbe peoples in particular, but not solely. So that historical background, I think, is important to then look at, okay, we're not dealing with only force, but there are different mechanisms for these theologies entering into African people's consciousness. And then, of course, transatlantic slaving makes a big difference, a huge difference, because now you're dealing with people who are captive, and captive peoples or captive audience is more susceptible to any theology that claims any modicum of freedom or liberation. So you see there? You see how historical context provides a fertile soil for religious dogma to enter as a rescuer and a saver. In other words, if African peoples were not enslaved and crossed the Atlantic, would we have these widespread Christian and Islamic communities? Probably not. Yes, there'll be some pockets of them, but probably not. And so it is when you have millions of enslaved people who then are bounded and captive in more than one way, they become more susceptible, more vulnerable to the seduction, the offerings of some type of liberation, some type of afterlife, some type of removal of the suffering and pain and trauma and death that is the unadulterated violence, the gratuitous violence that is transatlantic slavery and localized forms of slavery. And so what I'm suggesting here, actually what I'm saying here, is that the context of slavery married to the way that Islam and Christianity came to be across the African landscape provided a marriage that allowed for those religious dogmas to take a hold in diaspora communities the way that they have. All that said, how they have hindered the development, intellectual and spiritual development of African peoples, well, it's clear. There's a person I'd like you all to check out. You can find his narrative. It's through the UNC Chapel Hill website. It's a project called Document to the South. His name is Mohammed Ben Ali Said, and he has a book that he had wrote his autobiography in the 19th century, late 19th century. And he lays out what he saw coming from the Sudan. And Mohammed bin Said was a polyglot, spoke about 12 languages. And so he describes the effect of Islam coming into the Sudan, the Western Sudanic region in West Africa, on the indigenous communities that were there. That's one source out of many, but I would like you to check out that source because it comes from an African who was enslaved in multiple societies in Africa, in Europe, and in the Americas. And so you get an African perspective that both experienced Islamization as well as enslavement and the overtures of Christianity, because he was baptized in Russia as Nicholas Said. So you get a perspective from one who was Christianized and Islamized and who saw the violence between the two. So check out that work as to the question of hindering the development, intellectual and spiritual development of African peoples. And I'd rather you check that out and probe and question or take that question further than me essentially give you my view of that, because it's a broad question and it really depends on context. Where and when are we talking about? For example, there was little to any Islam in West Central Africa, in the Congo, Angola region. And so Islam doesn't feature there. In Southern Africa, Islam is not really there until much later, when there are captive people and migrants from South, East, and West Asia. And so that question of the hindrance of intellectual and spiritual development really depends on when and where, right? And so I will kind of hold back on generically talking about or responding to the question, and therefore suggest the book I just a moment ago by Muhammad Ali bin Said. Check out that narrative. Look at it. It's available free online. And I think you get some very important perspective. Another book I share with you to answer your question more fully is a book by yours truly. It's called Transatlantic Africa. Check out the second edition. It will answer that question and much more. There's a chapter on religion that I think will be helpful. And at the end of the book, in the appendix, I've attached excerpts from the narrative of enslaved Africans who either authored or dictated their experiences. So what you have there is from African people who experience the very historical forces that I'm speaking to at this moment. So those two books by Muhammad Ali bin Said on the website Documented South at UNC Chapel Hill Library, and my own Transatlantic Africa, for which you can check out more on my website, www.kwesikunadu.info. And so thank you again for this question and the others that have come. I've been your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu, for this episode of Power by Ancestry. Please continue to leave your questions, suggestions for other episodes, and your comment in the comment section below. Until next time, stay well.